Hello, everybody. This is the last section. We're going to be going over Chapter 4, voter participation in Texas, and talk about who votes, who participates, who doesn't, why, a little bit about who has responsibility for elections, and that kind of thing. Okay? And so the first thing we're going to start discuss about voting in Texas is that, like the United States in general, for much of Texas history, only white males had or could exercise their right to vote. Many groups couldn't, even though they may have had the right to vote. So, for example, African Americans, until 1867, in most states, they did not have the right to vote, especially in the South. Well, why during that period? Well, they were slaves, and they were quite literally property of their owners. And so owners didn't want to give slaves the right to vote. There would be a number of reasons why, but probably one of the most important was that you didn't want to give your slaves any sense of agency or any sense of having self-worth. And so if you asked your slaves or told your slaves, yeah, you get to have a say on these very important decisions, well, that's going to give someone a sense of self-worth. And so much of the early history of African Americans in the U.S., and indeed in Texas as well, since we were a slaveholding state, African Americans couldn't vote because they were property. Now, later on, after 1867, after a short period of about 10 years during what is often referred to as Reconstruction, they did get a little bit of time to vote. And during that period, and actually elected people to the state legislature and that kind of thing. Afterwards, they had that right, although technically they had it, that right was suppressed, and they weren't able to exercise that right. Another group that found themselves in a similar situation was Hispanic males. After the Spanish-American War ended in 1848, okay, technically, when they did the Treaty of Guadalupe Hidalgo, all of the Mexican American males who chose to stay in what had been Mexico, that was now the United States, they gained automatic U.S. citizenship, which means that not only they had the right to vote, they would have technically had the right to run for office and these kind of things. Well, for a variety of reasons that we won't really go over in this section, but if you take them from 2305, we kind of go over it a little bit. Mexican American men didn't participate. It did not take long for the Anglo population to be able to suppress most Mexican American men's ability to vote. Technically, very much like the African Americans, they had that right, but they weren't able to exercise that right. Okay, and would not be able to fully, like African American males, into the mid 1960s. Okay, right about the time that yours truly would be born in '68. Okay, African Americans, Mexican American males, and others would begin to start to really exercise the rights that they had. The last group that was not able to vote, and throughout most of Texas history, were women. Now, the one thing about women, and we go over this much more in 2305, is that whether you were white, whether you were Hispanic, whether you were African American, whether you're an Asian, Native American, whatnot, it did not matter. If you were a woman, you could not vote throughout most of Texas history. Afterwards, if you were a woman that is often described as a woman of color, Hispanic, African American, Asian, Native American, etc., while you technically had the right to vote, you did not get to exercise that right until the mid to late 1960s, or to begin to. Now, Anglo women, once women gained the right to vote, would be allowed to vote and did participate, although they didn't really get to necessarily always choose. They often had their votes were controlled by their husbands, their fathers, etc., because up into the mid-1960s, voting was a public. How you voted, who you voted for, was known, was public information. Today, it's not. It's private. Only you know how you actually vote. Okay? Well, when you look at the different groups, women actually did not get the technical right to vote until the passage of the 19th Amendment in 1920. Okay. And so, with the passage of the 19th Amendment, women began to get the right to vote. Well, when you look at the women's movement and the women's suffrage movement in Texas, it was a lot weaker than what you saw in other states. Now, there were the suffragettes in Texas. You can find pictures. Women marching down the streets of Dallas, holding signs, saying, there's suffrage now type of thing. Having sit-ins. All these things that you often think of as during the civil rights movement of the 60s, women were doing in the late second half of the 19th century, 1880s, 1890s, 1900, 1910, women were doing these kind of things. Well, one of the reasons why in Texas, the women's movement, the right to vote, all of that, didn't really have as much traction was that Texas was a slaveholder state, or had been. And the women's movement, and we go over this much more in 2305, it grew out of the abolitionist movement, which was the movement to end slavery. And so in states like Texas, the idea of women's rights was less acceptable than, say, other parts of the country, because it was tainted with this idea or this concept of anti-slavery movement, all of this, anti-segregation, civil rights, all of these kind of things. And so for a very long time in Texas, no woman got to vote until 1920. And then for about half, close to half, the women population, they didn't get to start voting until the mid to late 1960s, after the civil rights movement had barred a lot of the practices. Okay. Well, so women were one group that had their right to vote suppressed. Other groups would be minority voting rights, and often this suppression would be much more serious. Often, particularly for African Americans, it would be violent. And when I mean violent, I don't mean people yelling and screaming and that kind of stuff. I'm talking about people being hung, lynched, murdered for trying to exercise their legal constitutional right to vote. And so in Texas, for African Americans, it was much more difficult to vote than, say, for Mexican Americans. One of the big reasons why, is that the law did not support Mexican Americans being denied their right to vote, whereas in Texas, for African Americans, much of that discrimination was based on law. Okay, the law said that you could to do this or do that. That made it difficult for African Americans to do. Okay, and so when you look at Texas before the Civil War, African Americans, whether they were free or not, could not vote. So you could be what's called a freeman. Okay, if you don't know what a freeman is, that was the term given to someone who had been a former slave, or somebody in their past had been a former slave in the slaveholding South who was not a slave. Matter of fact, generally speaking, if you see people who are African American with the last name of Freeman, Morgan Freeman being probably the best example, there's a really good chance that somewhere in their woodpile, back in their family history, that there was a freeman there, that there was a African American male who was free. Okay, and that's where the term came. He was a free man instead of being a slave. Well, the Civil War kind of ended slavery, obviously. But one of the things that happened is that in the period afterwards, for more or less close to 100 years, 90 years or so, African Americans, although they technically had the right to vote, had their right to vote suppressed. And this was done through a number of means. One of the more important ones, there were structural reasons. Things like a poll tax. You had to pay money to be able to vote. African Americans, generally speaking, were amongst some of the poorest people in the state of Texas. And so the cost of poll tax could be prohibitive. Because often, while it wasn't a huge amount of money, for people who are on the more poor end of the spectrum, it might represent enough money to buy a week's worth of food or something like that that you couldn't afford to maybe give up. Even more insidious was the literacy test, where white election officials would determine whether you were literate. And often what they gave you was a passage to read that was in what's known as legalese English. It's how lawyers write. If you don't know what that kind of looks like, look at the contract that you have on your credit card or your cell phone, where they talk about all the terms and conditions. And if you're trying to read that, it's really hard. It's a very precise way of writing, but it's not how most of us write or think or that kind of stuff. So you have to almost be a trained lawyer to be able to understand it. And even then, sometimes they can write it in such a way that even trained lawyers can't understand it. Well, even if you were a trained lawyer who was African American and could easily read this legalese English, it was at sole discretion of the white poll worker to determine whether you did a good enough job or not. And so no matter how good you did, you always failed. Okay, and a white person who came in to try afterwards, no matter how bad they were, depending upon the circumstances, they may pass. Or there were plenty of times that, ironically, the poll taxes and the literacy exams were also used against poor whites. They were often used as a way to keep poor whites from being able to participate. Okay, now it wasn't nearly as bad as what African Americans experienced, but it definitely was something that the whites experienced. Then the last thing they had, what was known as the white primaries. Technically, the Democratic and Republican Party are private organizations. And in most instances in the United States, private groups get to determine who may join them and who may not. And they may make that decision based on anything or any criteria that they wish, including blatantly saying, if you're black, if you're Hispanic, if you're whatnot, you may not join our organization. Perfectly legitimate. Even today, okay, private organizations can decide whom they will associate with and whom they will not. Even if that way they do it otherwise would normally be considered illegal in other contexts. Well, when you look at that kind of activities, okay, the white primaries, that was the primary way that you chose who was going to run. Well, if you're African American in Texas and you weren't allowed to vote in the white primaries, then you didn't get to choose or even have the opportunity to choose who was going to run for whichever party. All you got to do at most was get to choose between the two candidates somebody else chose for you. And so that white primary allowed the Anglo population to dominate, okay, who got nominated. Okay, now later on, the U.S. Supreme Court would strike down the white primaries. The reason that they did, although they did say, yes, you are Democratic Party, you are Republican Party, a private group. You perform, though, an extremely important public function. Okay, choosing who is going to be running for public office. And that was such an important public function that you perform that you are not, in this case, you don't get to decide to discriminate. And so they forced the primaries to be open, forced all of that to be open to not only African Americans, but Hispanics and Asians, whoever. And it would take a bunch of different federal court decisions, Supreme Court decisions, as well as federal law, to over the course of 4, 5, 6 decades, to finally eliminate all the ways that the Democratic and Republican parties, depending upon where they were, tried to exclude minorities and these kind of things. Well, when you look at the experience of Hispanic disenfranchisement, the experience were in some ways very similar to what African Americans experienced. in other ways, quite different. Okay, one of the biggest distinctions between what African Americans experience in their disenfranchisement from voting and what Hispanics experience in their disenfranchisement in voting was that Hispanics often experience far less violence. Now, one thing you do have to make a distinction. There is a dividing line in Texas history. Pre-1900, post-1900. Post-1900 Mexican-American experience, and especially here in Deep South Texas, there wasn't a whole lot of violence, whether political or otherwise. Pre-1900 was a totally different story. Starting at about 1848 to about 1890, violence perpetrated against Mexican Americans and Mexican nationals by the white population was common. Okay, people being shot, people being lynched. Texas Rangers often would pursue Mexican Americans who were accused of a crime into Mexico, would violate Mexican sovereignty, and then summarily execute whoever they were chasing in Mexico. Okay. And so there was considerable violence pre-1900. Post-1900, though, there was almost no. Those of you who have taken me for 2305, one of the things we talk about, that probably one of the biggest differences between the Mexican-American experience and the African-American experience post-1900 was the radical different treatment that the black and white and Hispanic population got, with the Hispanic population not experiencing the violence that so often marred the black experience in the same time period. And so what you'd see in Deep South Texas, there weren't groups like the KKK. They didn't really exist like they did in the other parts of Texas in the South, where the Klan, Ku Klux Klan, was a very common feature. Okay, but the Anglo population used other tactics to suppress the Mexican American vote. One of the tactics that they used was the fact that the Anglo population, along with their Mexican American relatives, one thing you got to realize, especially in the land south of San Antonio, there were two classes of Mexican Americans. There was the elites. These were people who were married into and married with the Anglos, the big ranchers, the big landowners. Okay, you literally could have two guys or two gals, whatever the case may be. One whose last name was Garcia, the other whose last name was Johnson, and they were first cousins. Whether they had a Hispanic surname, whether they had an Anglo surname, simply was determined based on what lineage they came through. But they were related. Okay? If you were among that wealthy Mexican Americans who were related to the very large wealthy landowners, you didn't really experience any kind of discrimination. You didn't experience anything like that. If you were the average Mexican American, though, the Anglo population, in cahoots with the wealthy Mexican American relatives, would use intimidation and political corruption to keep you from being able to participate. Okay, well, how did they do that? Well, one of the things they would use is the fact that if you were Mexican American living in Deep South Texas at the time, you almost certainly worked for an Anglo. If you caused trouble, they would fire you. If you caused trouble and firing didn't work, then the sheriffs, the police, whatever, you could, depending upon what part of the South Texas you were in, you could just simply disappear. Okay, never to be seen from again. Okay. They also used corruption of the political process. It was very common in all areas of Texas, but particularly areas like the Valley, that Mexican Americans, men, would be given their right to vote. The only problem is when they went to go cast their ballots, they quite literally would be handed a ballot that was already pre-marked with the candidates' names that the white power structure wanted elected. Okay, and so you would get to cast a ballot but you did not get to choose. And so you didn't have effective participation. Yeah, you got to vote, but you didn't get to really choose. You didn't get to choose your candidate. Well, what would eventually end these kind of situations? Well, a number of important things would happen that would end disenfranchisement. Probably one of the most important would be the Voting Rights Act of 1965. That did two things that would be very important when it came to disenfranchisement of minorities, black and Hispanics in particular. One, and this was very, very important, voting became secret. Prior to that, how you voted was public information, like I previously said. And so if you boss told you better vote for XYZ candidate and you voted for ABC, they could fire you. As a matter of fact, they could fire you for whatever reason. There was no laws keeping them from doing that. There was literally nothing you could do about it. After the Voting Rights Act was passed and voting became secret, there was no way for them to know how you voted. Okay, so they could tell you better vote for XYZ. You say, yes, sir. You went into the ballot box in a voting booth and you voted for ABC candidates. And a few days later, your boss comes to you and starts yelling at you and other workers. He said, yeah, did y'all vote the way I told you to? And you go, well, yeah, boss, we did. Why? Well, my candidates lost. How did they lose? Well, I don't know, boss, but I voted the way that you told me to. When in fact, you did the exact opposite. But there was no way for them to know. Okay? And so, it being the fact that your ballot was secret. They also had poll observers. And these were generally Anglos, but they were from outside of Texas, often from the Midwest or the Northeast. And they had the backing of the federal government. And so they would show up and observe every aspect of the election. One of the things that did was it made it impossible for them to hand Mexican-American voters pre-marked ballots, or to double count, or to stuff extra ballots in, or these kind of things, because these old poll observers were watching. And because these poll observers had the federal government backing them up, they really couldn't be intimidated. I mean, you could go up as the sheriff or the police chief or whatever, some of your officers, and try to threaten these, saying, hey, South Texas can be dangerous, you better be careful. Sometimes people just disappear. That evening they walk in, they call Austin or San Antonio and talk to the FBI and say, hey, I've been threatened down here in McAllen, Texas, me and my people. And the next day, all of a sudden, there's 50 FBI agents and U.S. Marshals there. All of a sudden, that sheriff who thought he was big and powerful because he and his 10 officers had, pistols, were facing 50 FBI agents and U.S. Marshals. And if it caused even more problems, they could send in the National Guard. Okay, your six-shooter might be really impressive to someone who doesn't have a gun, but your six-shooter doesn't look so impressive compared to an entire battalion or regiment of combat troops. Okay, if that's what it came to. And so the Voting Rights Act, Supreme Court decisions that ended white primaries, the 24th Amendment that ended the poll tax, these kind of things, all of a sudden opened up elections for minorities. It eliminated those restrictions, those structural impediments to minorities voting. Well, when you look at participation voting, Texas residents, and this is true for people all over the country, can participate in the electoral process in many different ways. Now, for most of us, the most direct way we're going to be able to participate is through voting. But that's not the only thing we can do. Now, it is very, very important. Okay? When it comes to voting, okay, the ironic thing is that states have the primary responsibility for elections. Okay? And so votings would be very important, and you can go participate that way. And we'll talk a little bit more about that here in a second. The other thing you can do, and by the way, if you're going to vote, you got to be a U.S. citizen. You got to be 18, and you have to be registered. Well, what if you're not 18 or not a U.S. citizen? Can you participate in the election process? The answer is yes. Okay, now you can't participate directly in the sense of voting. Again, you got to be a U.S. citizen, 18, and registered. But what you can do is things like campaign. You can go volunteer for a candidate or the party that you like. You can go door to door, handing out leaflets, trying to convince people to register, trying to convince people to go vote for your candidate. You don't have to be a U.S. citizen to do that. You don't even have to be 18 to do that. Okay? You can, if you have the resources, donate money. Okay? And so you can give money to candidates up to a certain amount. Okay? You also can join all kinds of interest groups that try to impact. Probably the best known of the interest groups, and one of the most powerful and one of the most controversial, is the NRA, or the National Rifle Association. It's the Second Amendment, pro-Second Amendment interest group. It's been considered at times one of the most influential interest groups in the country. And at times, at least Democrats think it, whether it's true or not, that's just debate, that the NRA often can cause candidates in states like Texas, who take even a kind of a moderate anti-gun stance, sometimes find themselves losing elections. And they are credited to the NRA. Now, there's people who debate that, but there is no debate that the NRA is very influential. Okay. Lastly, you can actually run for office. The most direct way that you can impact what the government does is running for office. Because instead of voting for the person who's going to make the decisions, you, if you win, get to make those decisions. And that is a much more direct involvement and much more powerful. Well, when you look at voting in the state of Texas, okay, Texas, with some federal oversight, established the procedures for voting. So first of all, except for motor voter, they determine how you register to vote. So I've had students comment on the fact you can go online to the Texas Secretary of State website. You can click on register to vote. There will be a PDF. You can fill it out, but you have to print it off, sign it manually, date it, put it into an envelope, put a stamp on it, and mail it either to the Texas Secretary of State or your local county election administrator's office in order to register. And students have asked, why can't we just register online? Well, from a practical stance, there's no reason. We just have chose not to do so. Now, voting online, which in some ways would make a lot of sense. I've had students point out that, hey, if you got to have an app and you got to vote through an app, to make it so easy, and especially young people and even older people, sir, more people would vote. Awesome idea, except for one fatal flaw, and that is the concern about voter fraud. That if somebody can get into those apps, if they can manipulate what they do. Just look what happened in the 2020 election, yet with almost no evidence of any kind of voting fraud that was out of the ordinary. Okay, and definitely nothing that was at the level that fundamentally changed it. But if you actually did vote with apps and that kind of stuff online, there would always be that concern. And so for the vast majority of the arguments is very pro for that. It's just the idea of election security is the major flaw. There's, at least right now, no way to make sure that someone can't break in and do something. Anything that people have distributed that people can access from millions of points, there's always that potential that someone could do something to fiddle with stuff. Okay, now with the 2020 election, with those election machines, no. They weren't hooked up to the internet. You would have had to go in and manually infected everyone. And there's been zero evidence provided of that. People would yell and scream they have it until they get in front of a court or a judge where they have to tell the truth or they could go to prison or jail, and then all of a sudden they admit, no, I don't really have any proof. Well, what other things do the state of Texas get to do? Well, they decide residency requirement. When are you a resident of a state? The state gets to decide that. There's a process. You have to live here so long, change over your driver's license, register to vote, get a residency, a place to live, that kind of stuff. They also decide the election technology. And that has changed drastically over the years. When I was most of your age, it quite literally, one of the first elections that I voted in, it was a sheet of typing paper with just a handful of spots, offices, with 2 or 3 candidates' names, and they gave me a grease pencil. And if you don't know what a grease pencil was, think of something along with a giant crayon. And the idea was, if you made your mark, you could not erase that because it would just smear, and therefore people would know that somebody had tried to alter the ballot. And so the technology, whether you vote with a punch card, whether you vote with a touch screen, whether you have no printout, for a very long time, Hidalgo County had touchscreen voting machines, which are really nice to use. They're very convenient, they're very intuitive, that kind of stuff. But one of the issues is they had no paper backup. And if a machine crashed, and they occasionally do, I mean, any computer machine can potentially have some kind of fatal flaw happen that nobody did anything nefarious, it just happens. There was no paper backup, and so all those votes just disappeared. Today, if you voted in Hidalgo County, you know that you print off a paper ballot. And so if there is a question about the count, they can go take these paper ballots, run through an optical reader, or even have people look on them with their eyes and count the ballots and figure out who won the election. And so the technology that you use, voting location. Where are the voting locations? Those were decided at the county level. If you're at SDC during an election, you'll find out during the primaries or early voting. SDC will have, and they fought for this for years before they got it. We will have at SDC a voting machine for early voting, polling station, where you can go in between classes, or you can go after classes, or before classes, whenever that's convenient to you. The lines are usually relatively short, and you can cast your ballot on campus. So where you vote, they decide. Ballot format, what the ballot looks like. Those are decided at the state or county level. Whether to even allow early voting or not. Now, I love early voting. It makes voting simple. I always, if I remember, to vote early voting, because it's so much simpler than voting on election day. You don't have to figure out where your precinct is. You don't have to figure out where your precinct voting site is. You can vote anywhere in the county. Okay, makes it super simple. You just find a polling station, walk in, go through the process, and you vote. Not all states have it. Some states have had it and reduced it. Right now, Texas still has a 10-day voting period, a 14-day, where you can vote from 7 in the morning to 7 in the evening, anywhere in the county. You don't have to figure out where your place is, and that is a great way to do it because the lines are usually very small. It's quick, you can quickly do it. It's not going to be a situation where you're standing in the line for 3, 4, 5, 6 hours that you sometimes see on election day. Yeah, I don't get why so many people wait to election day, why they don't take advantage of early voting, because it does make the process so much easier. Okay, and whether or not to allow convicts, people convicted of a felony, not a misdemeanor, but a felony, whether they can vote. Now, in Texas, other states have other rules. In Texas, once you have completely your sentence, meaning you're no longer in prison, you're no longer on probation or parole, you've been completely released, you may register and re-get your right to voting. And you can start voting in Texas. A state like Florida, as far as I know, they're still this way. If you're a felon, you may never vote in Florida. Now, if you're a felon from Florida and they're saying you can't vote and you really want to start voting, well, guess what? If you're completely done with your sentence, you can move to Texas, take up residency. As soon as you take up residency, the next election, you may register to vote, and you can legally go vote. Doesn't matter that you couldn't in Florida, because Florida law doesn't apply here in Texas, and Texas law doesn't apply in Florida. And so you would be able to do so. Well, when it comes to participation, Texas doesn't have the best reputation for people participating. Okay? For example, in the 2008 presidential election, the turnout in Texas was about 55%, when nationally it was considered close to 60%. And that was in a presidential election. Presidential elections always have the highest turnout by far. In comparison, in very low profile contests, like I say, a constitutional amendment, we talked about it earlier, that it has to be part of election. Now, generally, they try to attach it to like a midterm election or a presidential election, but they can have elections solely for constitutional ballot initiatives to vote on constitutional amendments. For example, in 2009, they had a constitutional election, and turnout was less than 7%, which means out of every 100 Texans who could have voted, less than 7 did. 93 or a little bit more did not. Okay, and compared to other states, Texas tends to be a little on the lower end. Well, why would Texas have a lower voter turnout than some other states? Well, there's a number of reasons, and these will be reasons you'll be familiar with because we've talked about them in other contexts this semester. One is Texas's relatively low educational level. One of the better indicators of whether someone who's likely to participate by voting or not is educational level. If you have a high school degree or less, you're less likely, not that you won't, you're just less likely to vote than if you have a college degree or more. And so educational level plays in that. Well, one of the biggest impacts of educational level is on income level. And so people who have a higher income, who feel like they have more at stake in the system, are more likely to vote than people who have a lower income, who feel like they have a lower stake in the system. Which one of the ironies is the people with the lower income almost have more at stake in how the government works than the people who have higher incomes. They just don't realize it. And so we have relatively low income. And then lastly, a relatively generally lower, younger population. Texas has a lot more 18, 19, 20, 21, 22, 23, 24 years olds than most other states. We have a very young population compared to many other areas of the country. And for those of you, if you've taken me for 2305, might remember, we talked about young people, or the least likely group to vote. And since Texas has a larger section of young people, we have a lower voter turnout. But elections can vary greatly. Okay, participation patterns by income. Let's say higher income, more likely, lower income. Education, more likely, not, and race and ethnicity. Black and Hispanics, generally speaking, are less likely to vote than Anglos are. Okay, matter of fact, we've talked about numerous times this semester that the Anglo population in the state of Texas is considerably less than 50%. Matter of fact, one of the things we talked about is that the Anglo population, okay, is about 40%. The Hispanic population is about 40%. But it is not uncommon for Anglos to vote about 20 percentage points higher than their representation in society. And so Anglos make up about 40%. It's not uncommon for them to make up 60% of the voters. And so one of the things about elections, it doesn't really matter who has the largest population. What matters is who has the most people who vote. And so one of the reasons why the state of Texas is still largely dominated by Anglos, and why the Republican Party is dominating state politics right now, is that the white population, while still a significant part at about 40%, compared to 40% for Hispanics, 12, 13% for African Americans, is they way outvote as a percent of their population these other groups. Okay. Now, at some point in the not too distant future, in the next 10, 15, 20 plus years, the chances are the Anglo population will no longer have that dominant role. At some point, Hispanic population growth will just overwhelm the ability of the Anglo population to dominate the politics. Okay, now they will still be an important component, but at some point in the future, hard to know when, it's hard, that is hard to call, but at some point, the Hispanic population will start dominating the politics. Now, Democrats have been salivating about this, thinking that at some point, not unreasonably, that they will switch Texas from red to blue, because historically Hispanics support the Democratic Party in much larger numbers than Anglos do. One of the issues that has started to come up is that Hispanics, a growing percentage of them, are starting to lose that identity that they're Hispanic. And they're losing that attachment to the Democratic Party. And you're seeing even candidates like Donald Trump, former President Trump, who in many ways made all kinds of insinuatory comments about Hispanics, saw his percentage of the vote go up. For Democrats, this is a nightmare scenario. If you see in the next 10 to 15 years, Hispanics vote roughly 50-50, Democrat, Republican, or God forbid, as far as the Democrats are concerned, indeed, Hispanics shift over and more Hispanics vote for Republicans than Democrats, that blue wave in Texas that the Democrats have been dreaming about for several decades very well may not come to fruition. Okay, now whether that's true or not, time will tell. Okay, and I'm hoping that I'll get an idea before I'm no longer here on this earth. Okay, well, that's the last of the stuff that we need to talk about for the test on this next Monday. I will get these in Blackboard, where you'll be able to click on the videos, watch the videos. You should have someone took pictures and should have sent it through the Pronto app. If you don't have access to those, let me know. Contact me on Pronto, and I will be more than glad if you need me to. If you're not able to get with any of the groups to get the copy of the lecture notes, to take pictures of them and send them to you myself. Okay? But other than that, y'all have a great day, and we'll see you on Monday. Bye.